Hello and welcome to all of my decision makers out there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I know you're probably here because you're looking for more time, right? And you probably saw this topic and you were like, more time? Yes, please. Well, there's a reason that the saying, there's just not enough hours in the day. There's a reason that's a saying, because so many people are faced with the plight of seeking more time. You are not alone. So my name is Raisa Noel, and I am the Global Program Events Lead with Women in Cloud. Thank you to all of you for joining us for Commit to a Conclusion. Today, we're going to dive into how to create more time with effective decision making. So before we get started, I want to share with you a few things about how to engage during today's session. So you can participate in the chat. Make sure that you share your comments. You can use the emojis. Connect with us on social. We also have a kudo board that's essentially like a virtual greeting card, and that we're all signing and sharing insights and comments from the sessions. And I'll be sure to share that link with you in just a couple moments. If you're sharing on social media, please use hashtag Women in Cloud, hashtag She Soars, or hashtag WIC Power 2021. So we have a great panel of thought leaders sharing insights today on the real aim of unlocking your conclusion commitment and understanding your decision-making style, and yes, helping you get more time. So first, I want to ask you, what would you do if you had more time? Let us know in the chat. I want to see those answers. Great. So people are already engaging in the chat. This is incredible. Okay, so what would you do if you had more time? Learn SQL, read more books, decompress. Yes, go for long walks, dance more, sleep more, jungle trip. These are great answers. Watch movies. That's a great one. Lots of reading. Okay, explore Seattle. Yeah, for myself, I would travel. I love trying new foods. I would just, oh my gosh, I'd spend more time baking, traveling, knitting, doing all sorts of stuff I don't really have much time to do right now. So how many of you have been faced with a moment that made you do something like this? It's been proven that overthinking increases your chance of mental illness, it disturbs your sleep, and it actually interferes with problem solving. Chances are you just want to get it right. There's nothing wrong with that, but your brain may be firing on all cylinders, and it might feel like there are too many tabs open in your brain browser, right? And brain fatigue is real. Overthinking, overcomplicating, and I can imagine you're simply over it at this point. So, well, today we want to get you to the point of starting to recognize the type of decision maker you are, understanding how to commit to a conclusion, and ultimately closing some of those tabs in your brain browser and leaving you with more time. So with that, I would love to welcome to the stage to join me the panel moderator for today's session, Emily Craven. She is the CEO of Story City. Emily, please join me. Thank you. And now over to you. I'll hand it over to you to introduce our panelists for today.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. We are very excited to have you all here today for Commit to a Conclusion. We have some fabulous fabulous panelists here with us today. I'm going to call them onto the stage, but rather than doing the traditional, reading out their bios, as we sort of dive into the questions, I will let them introduce themselves and their experience. But can I welcome to the stage, please, Ram Dutt, Michelle Florendo, Lynn Frankel, Michael Kenny, and please come on stage, everybody. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. While we are definitely going to be diving into the questions in just a moment, I wanted to not only thank you guys very much for coming today, but maybe give us a bit of a story to bounce off to start getting people thinking in and around that. That's kind of my specialty. I worked for a company called Story City. We do location-based storytelling, so experiences that only open when you're standing in the right location. So stories are always a great way for me to gain some learnings and to have a way that we can kind of bounce off and start a discussion. So I wanted to talk a little bit just before we started about one of the biggest decisions I have had to make over the past 6 months recently, which was letting go a lead developer in our team. So this is in the past 2020, we've expanded our team from like 2 people to 5 people. We became a real startup with we have our lead developers and our UX team and our sales team, which has been very exciting. But as part of that, I obviously had to learn a bit about culture management and decision making, and making sure that I was doing the decisions that were needed to unblock my team. And so our lead developer was someone who had come on board. He was a great person, very sweet and supportive and positive. He really likes to have a collaborative environment. He had worked for 30 years as a developer, and so he had worked with a lot of different languages. But as our time kind of went on and we were developing out a new functionality within our product, I found that we weren't getting into the detailed planning that I would have expected of someone with his experience, and that the operational side of things that we needed for our growing team wasn't there. And so at first I thought that it might be a leadership style thing. I like to talk through these things to discover expectations, how are people's different leadership styles. But as we had these discussions and things didn't necessarily change, I had to kind of change how I did my decision-making process. So I had originally started with a bit of mentorship. When that wasn't working, I started reaching out to CTOs that I knew within our city to ask them, like, what would you expect a person in this position to know? And I kind of gathered my information to make my decision. I pulled together a job description of what the expectations were that I kind of had. And it was only when I pulled together this job description and had these talks with other people in my field that I had realized that the skill set that our lead developer had was not the one that we needed for the stage that we were at in our company. And it wasn't that he wasn't good, it wasn't that he wasn't competent, it was just that he didn't have the operational processes that we needed. And so what ended up happening was that we ended up parting ways with this lead developer. And I learned a couple of really key things. So one of them was that essentially decisions are not irreversible. So when we first brought on this lead developer, we had also spoken to another lead developer at the same time who just didn't have the capacity to work with us at that time. And so when I went back to that lead developer to revisit, did they have this capacity? Are they interested in potentially working with us? I found that not only did they have the capacity, but now that I had the job description and a much better idea of who we needed, I knew exactly what questions to ask them to figure that out. And it turned out that we ended up being able to work with this new lead developer that we had talked 2 months ago. And so the decision, it turned out, didn't end up being as irreversible as I had feared. And the other thing that I learned was, or I finally understood, was beginning with the end in mind. If I had had that understanding of what was needed at the start, we may not have gone down this path with the wrong person. And the final thing was that I needed to learn to make decisions quicker. And potentially, if I had attended this panel about 6 months ago with these wonderful experts, I may have been able to do that. So I am very selfishly going to ask all of the questions that I wish I had known 6 months ago from these wonderful people. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I am really excited to dig into things with you. And I think I wanted to start off with wondering, how do you relate to decision making? So like, what are the like centers of intelligence that you rely on to make your decisions? And I'm going to pick out of a hat Michael to start us off on this.
Thanks. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon, and hopefully we're going to bring some potentially enlightening experiences to you, mostly from the other panelists, and I'll share my abstract thinking and making decisions. It was interesting. I had actually had a similar conversation with my 13-year-old son about decisions and how to make decisions very recently, especially during COVID, and being stuck at home, and also how to think through, as he makes decisions on his own about sports and going out and being around friends. And he kind of goes, "Dad, how do you make decisions?" And it made me pause for a minute, because I tended to think of decisions and I put them in buckets. I put them in buckets as far as, are these daily life decisions? Are these things that I can make a quick assessment and make a decision and understand what the outcome is going to be, because it's a relatively quick return on what that decision looks like? Or are these types of business decisions that are going to impact other people, lives, financials, whatever it is we're trying to do from a business perspective, that have a lot of what I would call waterfall effects and other decisions that need to continue to affect the outcomes that you're trying to march towards. And trying to communicate that to a 13-year-old was quite frankly like, that was a terrible idea, right? And so I'm thinking through all these, business leaders, the ones that have influenced us over the years, and I'm like, I got to throw all that out and come back to, hey, Logan, when you get up in the morning, you've got a decision: do you brush your teeth or not brush your teeth? And if you don't brush your teeth, you're going to have cavities. And it might not affect you that day, but the long term, it's going to be painful. And it's going to be something you're going to have to go back and self-correct. And that behavior, you're going to continue to have those judgments and those abilities to make decisions. And if you think about them in a current state, then you want to think about what the evidence looks like and what the impact's going to be to what your current state and environment is going to be. And if they're, what you would consider longer term decisions that have meaningful impact on what a future state looks like, think really through what evidence that looks like, right? And be very specific about that evidence and how that you think about that in your life. And then how does that actually impact you on a daily basis? And if you can quantify how these decisions impact you on a current state, what impact they have in your daily basis, and then what that potential future state looks like, and how does that really potentially impact you in your life and getting to where you want to become as a person, whether it's school, sports, socially, whatever. How does that help you get to that end result? And if you can think through those equations of evidence impact, current state, evidence impact, future state, and ultimately how that creates that ultimate decision, I think you'll get to a better spot, son. And quite frankly, just go right over them. So I'd like to think that there's some, thought behind what we're talking about today, and we've got some great examples. Hopefully it's a little more meaningful to everybody else here than my 13-year-old thought it was. And but I really appreciate being here, and that's kind of a story of decision making and how I think about it. And hopefully we'll dive in a little bit deeper into some more quality stuff in this panel.
Thank you. Michelle, I would like to know a little bit about how you relate to decision making. What do you rely on to make your decisions?
Well, first off, when I think about how I relate to decisions, I'll just admit I'm a decision-making geek. So I studied decision engineering in undergrad, and I guess when I think about centers of intelligence, I'm very heady. And so I'm the type of person, I don't know if there's anyone in the room who loves having all the data and crunching all the data. And my training really helped me with frameworks in order to do that. I mean, you might see there's a decision tree back here. I think the last time I had to make a decision about whether to get pregnant with a possibly like risky pregnancy, I actually drew out a decision tree. So that's how I think. But what I find really interesting about decision making is not actually the data and what frameworks we can use for crunching the data. I've been really fascinated by the emotional side of things. And so what I found is that my training in decision engineering, while useful, is sometimes not as useful for messy decisions that we are making on the fly in the face of uncertainty with very limited data, or even when we're paying attention to factors or objectives that are hard to measure. And that has been like my recent area of geeking out. I also found it really interesting. I work as an executive coach now. And so previously I would teach people structures. So, okay, what are the 3 components of every single decision? Your options, your objectives, the information. How do you deconstruct your decision and move through it? I'm really fascinated now about how can we support people to tap more into their fast thinking or their practical wisdom in order to avoid decision fatigue. And so really focusing on the micro decisions. I think Michael had talked about there's some macro decisions like, where's this business going to go? Where are we going to invest this money? And then there's also the micro decisions that we make, but they add up over time. And I find that even, especially when we're talking about this concept of decision making in order to create more time, sometimes it's not necessarily those big decisions, but it's also how is it that we are engaging with those small decisions.
I love that. And I mean, decision fatigue is real. But the higher up you go in the responsibility chain, the more and more you look at, okay, not only do I have to deal with my decisions, I have to deal with other people's decisions, and it's an interesting mix. But I love the idea of doing a decision tree. And there is actually something that I need to decide right now that I am 100% tonight doing a decision tree, and maybe we can dive into that a little bit later. Lynn, Ram, did you have anything in particular that you wanted to talk about around how you relate to decision making?
Thank you. I, first of all, really appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective with all of you, and I hope you find some value within it. I'm a social decision maker. And so unlike Michelle, I absolutely want as much of the data as I can have. So that's very much like Michelle. But I have a small group of people that I call my committee. And they're not people who are in my business. They are people who I have collected over the years and trust really strongly. And I'd suggest if you don't have those people in your life, you might find them here in the Women in Cloud community. But I like to get feedback. I like to talk it through with people. Ultimately, my ideal scenario would be to be a consensus maker in making decisions. That's not always possible, especially as you rise throughout an organization, or maybe you're the leader of the organization. But I think the higher you go, the lonelier it gets. The decisions are harder. They're more impactful. You need people around you. Let me say it this way. I need people around me who are going to help support me in making the best possible decision that I can make.
Indeed, and I feel like maybe with that committee as well, there are certain people that you wouldn't go to for certain things. So it's not necessarily
100%. Absolutely. You need to know your audience, and you need to, know a little bit about what you need in the process, because you want to find people who can give you that.
And how do you find that when you talk to your committee around that? How do you, I suppose, pass the fact that maybe if they've been in similar situations, that they may not be the exact same situations? How do you find that you can handle that separateness?
Well, I'm fortunate that for me, my committee is comprised of people that I know very, very well. They're not people that I've just recently collected. I have decades of experience with them. And so I sort of know who to talk to about what, or understand where their experiences and the decision that I'm trying to make diverge from my own. And I think ultimately it's important that as we make decisions, we do the right thing, even when it's hard, maybe especially when it's hard. And you need people that are going to support you through that, whether that's the same decision they would have made or not. So I think you pick your people carefully and then hold on to them with both hands.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lynn. Ram, how do you pass your decisions?
Well, I thought, I would give some good information, but, our panelists are so amazing that I now have a decision tree, decision committee that I can, it's not about you have not done it, but it's all about remembering to say, hey, these are the techniques that you need to use it. One thing I wanted to share about, Emily, you talked about letting go of a developer, right? This phrase keeps on coming to my mind is hiring is a gut feeling, but firing or working with them is a choice. So we are making a decision at that time, right? So you don't have to feel bad that you hired somebody and then it didn't work out, because you never know. You can never know how deeply, how it is going to work out, right? So just wanted to share that. I'm a serial entrepreneur, so decisions are definitely part of my day-to-day life. I look at from a professional versus personal, and all of them are interrelated. No matter what, which you think, a professional decision will eventually impact a personal life or impact that. So these are the four things that I keep going through it. Is why do I have to make this decision? That's the question I ask myself. And what is the short-term and the long-term impact or risk? And can I make a commitment for the outcomes and consequences, both? So positive and negative. And the fourth one is, can I own it? If it doesn't work, can I learn from it? So if it works, great. If it doesn't work, what can I learn from it? Those are the questions I ask to make a decision.
Well, you've posed a very interesting question that I did want to continue on with, which is, how do you reflect on, when you do that reflection on your decision making, when you come to the owning it part, when you have that reflection on the decision making, how do you integrate what you have learned into your future decision making?
I'll give you an example of stock trading. I think it's a simple, easy one that I can just, have enough experience to say, oh. So, you make, stock trading. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, but sometimes it's really bad. So how do you learn from it, right? First thing is, you cannot get gun shy. So that means you are in the motion of going to keep making decisions. That's number one. That's a lesson to be learned. Second thing is, you just list out, and I think you have to go through that decision-making tree, document it, or even the committee, find those people to understand what has happened. So, there's no hardcore one answer, but the whole idea is to not shy away from making the next decision. That's what I would say.
Very interesting. And do you have, is not becoming gun shy, is that a mindset? Does that come with time? Is there like a way that you shake yourself out of that?
I think that's the fourth point I made. Can I own it? If I can own it, then there is no fear. If I cannot own it, then you are always living in the past, and you're constantly playing the same movie again and again, and you're not moving forward.
Wonderful. I would love to ask the rest of the panelists, and feel free to jump in if you feel like you have something to add. No point in us like going through every person, but like, do any of you have some things that you would like to add to the conversation around how you integrate those lessons and reflections into your future decision making?
Well, I think what you said about not being gun shy and being willing to own your decisions is really on point. And I also want to acknowledge that sometimes it's hard. And I want to talk a little bit about why I see that it's hard. So many times I'm talking to people, or when I'm teaching a workshop on decision making, I'll focus in and actually ask people about quality of the decisions. Or, why is it that people get gun shy? What is it that they fear? And if I ask the audience, often it's, well, I don't want to make a bad decision, or I don't want to make a wrong decision. And so then I'll double click in about, well, what is it that makes a decision bad? And oftentimes people will say, well, if the outcome was bad, lost a bunch of money in the stock market. And that's actually something that is a common fallacy when it comes to the quality of decisions, because so often we think that the quality of the decision is equal to the quality of the outcome, in that, oh, if the outcome was good, I must have made a good decision. And if the outcome was bad, I must have made a bad decision. But the thing is, that's not actually true, because outcomes are a function of both our decision and then often also things that happen outside of our control. And so it's really important to remember that the quality of a decision is separate and distinct from the quality of the outcome. And I think that understanding can help people, own their decisions more. They can own the decision part, but they may not necessarily own the piece that they couldn't control.
I would just add to what Michelle said. She hit on a couple of things that are really central for me. One is she talked about fear. And I think for a lot of people, fear plays a central role. Certainly not everyone. You may not be one of the people that fear plays a role for, but I know for me, it was a very big part of my decision-making for a lot of years. And it was, or lack of decision-making might be a better way to say it. Fear of making the wrong decision, or fear of what people were going to think of me based on this decision. And, I hate to say that it came with age and experience, where you start to shed some of that, and you just really understand that, when I realized in my 30s that I was making decisions based on fear of whatever, fill in the blank, it enabled me to start to be aware of that through the decision-making process. And frankly, coach myself. We've got that voice in our head that says all kinds of horrible things to us, but we can also train it to say some positive things and to help you get over the hump of any fear that exists in making a decision. Because as you said, Emily, at the very onset, most decisions are not irrevocable. Not all of them are good. And I would also add this judgment around a good or bad decision, in addition to what Michelle said about all of the factors outside of our control that contribute to the outcome of that decision. I also think there's the what of the decision, what the outcome actually is, but then there's also the how you got through the process. Once the decision is made, I'm not talking about how you make the decision. I'm talking about what happens after the decision is made, and how you bring people along with you on that journey, or how you get access to the resources that you need in order to deliver on the decision that you made, or how you just simply own that decision. And I think that the how piece of that also contributes to whether or not it can be evaluated as a great decision or not. Because if you've left a lot of dead bodies to get to that outcome, I would suggest to you it's not a good decision.
Any recommendations or thoughts around how you look on the bright side of a decision? Because as you said, we tend to look on the negative side of decisions a lot. Consequences is a word that we've used multiple times already in the first half hour. Do you have how do you turn that bright side on?
I think that I don't know if you're asking me or if you were asking the group, but I think it depends what you focus on. I think there are things to celebrate even in loss or going in the wrong direction. Certainly, it may be heavier gravity around things that went wrong, right? From a very young age, we're taught to focus on what we did wrong, not what we did right. But I think even that is a choice. And there is always a choice about what to focus on. And while it's hard, this is where that committee really comes into, really helps you out in the end, because even in light of making a decision that didn't turn out and has consequences that you perhaps didn't want or ask for. There's probably learning. There's probably something you can point to that changes the trajectory of your business, your life, you know, whatever the context is, that can be very positive. But sometimes you need some help seeing those things, depending on the gravity of the decision.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lynn. I've been seeing quite a few comments in the general chat where some people are wanting to know a little bit more about Michael's coaching people through waterfall decisions. They want to understand what that is about. And then other people are wanting to understand the decision tree. And I feel like they may have similar things in common. So like I might get Michael to talk a little bit about the waterfall decisions, and then Michelle can jump in as to whether or not her decision tree differs in that methodology.
Sure, absolutely. In fact, I think it might be important to really even take a step back and talk about what we make decisions about, right? Because what I kind of heard all through a lot of the conference the last few days is it's really a conversation about risk, right? And it's an inherent understanding of your ability to take risk, how comfortable you are with risk, and what types of data or perspective you want to have as you qualify making those decisions based on the types of risk outcomes and factors you're looking through, right? So as we kind of talk about decisions, I spend a lot of time coaching entrepreneurs and working in the venture business. So I kind of think about risk at a very intricate level, and that's kind of how we do our business. And we spend a lot of time coaching our entrepreneurs to basically be experts at taking risk, because that's how you're going to live and die as a business, right? What types of risks you want to take, when you want to take those, and how to counter and balance those based on all the other factors involved to make that a successful decision, and the amount of decisions that are going to take place after you make that initial go ahead to green light something, not green light something, and the flow down types of decisions that are going to take place that aren't always on your table, that are going to be in other people's hands, that are going to have to take place in order for that outcome that you were thinking takes place. So, you know, in our community, my goalposts are pretty big, right? I don't have to look and think that when I make a decision that it needs to stay within a particular swim lane or stay very focused. If they're kind of making a decision somewhere in there, we can find, you know, hopefully staying within those goalposts, we're going to be able to see some type of a better outcome in return. Other people don't have that same type of risk factor or calculation where they feel like, hey, I need to make very specific decisions that are going to have outcomes that need to be within these kind of lanes, right? And have these kind of outcomes. And so I think it's really getting back to that level of understanding and becoming an expert on risk, your comfort level, how that risk is going to impact you as a business, as an entrepreneur, as a leader, as a group member, a team member, whatever that is, but get an intricate level and understanding of risk. And the better, and as I think we heard that too from Lynn, right, is you become a little bit more seasoned in the ages and the hairs and stuff. We become better experts at risk and what we're comfortable with as humans, right? And different parts of your life cycle as well. You're prone to accepting risk at different levels, right? So I think that's where, you know, obviously Michelle's expertise in coaching and helping people coach throughout different phases of not only their journey, but also their business's journey is really important. And I think she can probably talk a little bit more about the decision tree and so forth, because quite frankly, I think my bosses and investment partners sometimes wish I would do a little bit more decision tree stuff. So.
I love this discussion of risk because the field of decision engineering was born out of how is it that we create a process for evaluating really high stakes, risky decisions. I mean, it's the field that was used to evaluate decisions around like nuclear reactors and like NASA missions. But I think there's a couple things that I wanted to jump on. And so when you're talking about risk, I wanted to double click on, you know, how do we even think about risk, right? Like there's a couple different factors to risk. There's one, the magnitude of the risk, and then also likelihood of the risk. And I think those are two good things to think about, because sometimes there will be risks that are great in magnitude but low in likelihood, and there might be risks that are, you know, smaller in magnitude but higher in likelihood, and it's just a matter of understanding like what are your sensitivities to that. I think another thing that I think is interesting is that, you know, as humans we are hardwired to think about the bad things, and I think this goes to what we were talking about before, like looking at the bad things that might happen, the bad things that did happen. And there's something that I actually really appreciate about decision trees. And okay, so I'm not going to talk about how to construct a decision tree here. I'm just going to say it's a tool for visualizing some of the things that we are thinking about and the considerations in a decision. But what I love about decision trees, it's not actually a mapping of risk. It's simply a mapping of actions like decisions and uncertainties. And I liked making this distinction between the word risk and uncertainty, because risk we usually interpret as the possibility that bad things will happen. Whereas uncertainties, it's a little bit more neutral. I mean, Michael, you might appreciate this story because I learned about this through playing travel roulette. And so I don't know if anyone's heard about travel roulette. Of course, this is pre-COVID times, but basically the rules of travel roulette are you pack a bag, you go to the airport without a destination in mind, you have an hour to pick a destination or book a ticket that's under $500 and you go. And I ended up booking a ticket to Austin. I had never been before. And I'm one of those people who likes to plan. What I learned from the experience, there are so many incredible things that happened to me on that trip that I could have never planned. And it just brought into clear focus that at least sometimes when looking at decisions, yes, the risk part is important, but it's also useful to flesh out what might be on the upside too.
With when we talk about risks and those levels of risks, it does bring to mind, we are at the Women in Cloud Summit, and I do wonder how your thoughts on the fact that different demographics have different risk tolerances, or society views those risks that they take differently. So, women and even, people of color will have been trained in certain tolerances of that risk. And when looking from the outside, like when I think of like investors looking at startups that are, women-led in comparison to male-led, and what risks are celebrated for men in comparison to what risks are celebrated for women, I would love to have a discussion on that and around that.
Just real quick, I think that's an awesome point. It should actually be an entire separate conversation, right? What was alarming is obviously the success metrics are there because truthfully, we're just not betting on enough women-led businesses. There's not enough women who are taking the risk to start businesses because the ecosystem's not there to support them. And there's also some other aspects that are going on in there that we need to fix. But ultimately what we hear though is you're right. The truth is we need to have that odds needs to get better, because what that means is there's more investment taking place. There's more risk taking place, people betting on women entrepreneurships. There's more women taking risks, starting businesses and taking that, having that opportunity to fund and also to fail, right? So we need more successes, but we need more failures, because the failures show an indicative sign that we're continuing to invest equally across the border and create more opportunity for women entrepreneurs to start a business and go through the same odds of not having necessarily the right success. But what we want to do is show an even playing factor, an opportunity for everyone to have that opportunity to get investment and start a business and really go through the opportunity cycles to create great businesses, right? And so that's where I guess it's like we need to, bottom line, we're not seeing enough opportunity, we're not seeing enough investment, and we're not having enough women take the risk to start businesses, and that's a problem that we need to fix.
I might quickly ask the ladies here, as female decision makers, have you been able to adjust your risk tolerances, or is this something that I, as a young woman looking at my decision-making future, have kind of just got to let consequences and experience be the guide there?
Yeah, I would say this is an area where my social approach really plays a role, because I wouldn't say that I have adjusted my risk tolerance, and I would say generally I probably don't take as many risks as I should. But I know that about myself. And when I think back about the environments in which I've been the most successful, it's because I have hired people that I know are risk takers that will push me along in my decision-making process. Again, having the desire to have a social process, that doesn't mean you don't make the hard decision. I'm not saying you abdicate responsibility for the decision, but I'm advocating that if you know where your weakness is, and if your weakness is you're a low risk taker, you might consider finding some people that you trust that can help push you a little bit so that you are willing to take those risks and maybe go a little bit further. And, if you're not outside your comfort zone, you're not growing. And that comes with experience, and it comes over time. And it's, a lot easier for a 50-something-year-old woman to say than it is for maybe a 20-something-year-old woman to say. But I think with that experience, I know I need to surround myself with people who will push me to take more risks. And it's been an effective approach for me. I don't know, Michelle, if you have more to add to that.
I mean, I do think there's something there about it, knowing your own risk preference and surrounding yourself who might have a different perspective, or at least may be able to be a good sounding board. I think one of the things that I'll add, when we talk about risk, sometimes we just talk about it in vague terms, risk, something bad that might happen. But I think we need to be a little bit more precise about what is at risk, because sometimes there may be a tendency to assume that we're all talking about the same thing, like financial risk, or risk if it's like personal decisions. Sometimes when I'm coaching people and ask them about their fears and what it might be all the way down the road, it becomes, well, what if I end up, losing all my money and I'm homeless? And then we'll go back to, well, what are the things that you are trying to optimize for? Like I had mentioned or briefly touched on the 3 components of any decision before, and I just wanted to say it again. You have objectives, options, and information. And it's critically important to define what are those objectives up front, because if you don't, we might talk about risk in a way that isn't actually prioritizing your objectives. Like you might make decisions optimizing for what other people's objectives are, instead of recognizing that actually maybe the risk here is the risk of not being able to meet your objective. And I think that's how my views of risk have changed. Like I'll speak freely as a mom of 2 under 5. There are certain decisions that other people may have viewed as risky based on what they thought I would be optimizing for. But when I keep in mind, I want to be able to mother a certain way during a certain period of my children's lives. And I actually see that, certain decisions that I've made are not risky when that is what I'm optimizing for. So being clear on objectives. And I think that's where you can also use your social committee to help you vet decisions.
Can I add a perspective?
Please.
I think when the women are making decisions and they're considering their risks, I think one of the things, even for men, I would say, is the environment and the family also is an important factor. If you like Michelle said, if I lose all the money, then what? Will that affect whatever it is? I think if the same thing is if you have a strong family or people around you that understand you and can be supportive, I think the tolerance for risk increases because you are willing to bet on bigger bets because you believe, from your gut that yes, it's okay. Worst case scenario, I'm still okay. So.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of your insights and thoughts into that. I find it very interesting perspectives, and the idea that, like surrounding yourself with people who have different risk levels. I've heard people talk about like when you select a co-founder to make sure that your risk tolerances are not completely different. Otherwise, that's where a lot of the co-founder kind of butting heads comes from. So I definitely understand when you guys talk about that. There's definitely a balance still to achieve there. But I did want to. I know we only have around about 10-ish minutes left, and some some of the audience have put forward questions. So I want to try and touch on a couple of these that have been upvoted. So one of the questions from the audience is, do you find your most difficult decisions coming from your personal or professional lives?
Repeat that. What was the question?
Find your most difficult decisions coming from your personal lives or your professional lives?
Very, very deep question, I guess. I would say personal life, because in professional life you can change a job, you can shut down a company, start a company, but when it comes to personal life, I think emotion is a very deep, goes very deep, and that I think those are more tough decisions. I feel personally for me is personal life decision.
I think that probably plays a little bit into what Michael was talking about earlier, where like it's a question of does the decision involve other people, or does it just involve like something kind of mechanical? And a lot of business decisions you're kind of making, like you do have a team, and so there are other people involved. But I think that definitely the closeness of the people has a much bigger way of making a decision seem more weighty or more cloudy. In general. And I think that Ram, you're also saying previously that the personal and the business kind of anything that you make in your kind of professional life will affect your personal life in some way. So I think that like they're always going to be intertwined, because whether it's a financial thing or it's a happiness thing or like they I think they're much more intertwined than we think they are. And I think that is potentially a mistake to believe that they are more separate than that.
Yeah, I would add, for me, the answer is definitely personal and very aligned to what Ram shared. But I do think it depends on how you define yourself and your own self-worth. Because I know when I made the decision to leave Microsoft after almost 30 years, I had to really think about, did I have an identity? Who was I if I wasn't working for Microsoft? Like, it was so intertwined with who I was as a person that I really had to separate and say, I am not defined by what I do. I'm defined by other things, like the kind of children I've raised and men that I've put out in the world, in my sons. And so I think it's personal for each person. For me, it is the personal decisions are tougher, but I really had to take a pause to say, I am not defined by what I do in order to separate myself from that decision. And I think it ties to what Ram shared about the emotional component and tie into the decisions.
%. And with those personal decisions as well, like, you obviously have your committee of people that you speak to about that. And one of the audiences wanted to know how you choose people within that committee that can offer you support without feeling like you're encroaching on their time.
Well, I think you have to have people that you meet that are willing. I wouldn't suggest, meeting someone on LinkedIn and the next day asking them to be a part of your committee. I think you need to have a relationship with people. I think you need to ensure that your values are aligned, because I think you can get into all kinds of trouble. You mentioned, I think, when picking a co-founder, you want to have a similar risk tolerance, but I think you want to have aligned values with people who are going to help inform important decisions that you make in your life or in your business. And so I'm not going to suggest that committees get made overnight. I don't believe they do. I do think, particularly within the Women in Cloud community, there are a lot of people that are willing to lean in and help, maybe on a one-time basis. Maybe someone doesn't become a member of your people committee overnight, and instead it's hey, I've got something big, I need to talk, and I heard you speak, and I'd love to spend a half an hour. I think you got to be thoughtful about how much you're asking from people who you don't know well. But like one of my people is my sister. She's a CEO, and she's got all kinds of vast experience. I've known her a long time. And so I know our values are aligned. I know she's willing to spend time with me. But some of those other relationships, you got to work a little harder at, and it takes time, and you need to invest that time for yourself.
Thank you, Lynn. I wonder in those situations where you can't necessarily choose your committee. So when you are, say, working in a team of people who are different types of decision makers. So one of the people in the crowd is saying that they are a collaborative decision maker, and so they depend on their team to provide data and feedback in a very similar method to what it sounds like from you, Lynn, collecting all of that feedback and that sort of community data. But they're asking, like, how do you get a whole team on board with this? So it sounds like they have a team member who is potentially not the type of decision maker, that collaborative decision maker that they are. So how do you mesh with those different decision making types and make them work together? And this, I don't know if you want to comment on this, on Lynn, or whether Michelle might be someone who has some insights on that.
When I think about group decision making, I think about the importance of having a common language for discussing how decisions are made, right? Like the process, so when I think about types of decisions we may make, you can think about, in options, are we going to go with just like one single option? Do we want to explore multiple options at the same time? In the information bucket, can we agree on whether we can move forward with just like a few key facts, or do we really want all the data? And so there's like this meta conversation that can be had around the process first, and see if we can get people on board with that, and then address the different components to see where we can build consensus. Or, consensus is only one process for group decision making. There's many others, but that's something that comes to mind.
I would add that having some guiding principles in that initial set of discussions, I think, Michelle, you referred to them as objectives. I thought it was something different until you continued talking. I think what I call guiding principles, you call objectives. But if you can agree on what is most important to you in the process of making the decision, whether it's made unilaterally, or it's made by committee, or it's made in small groups, or however you go about making that decision, I think if everyone can agree on what the guiding principles are, you have a much better chance of coming to a decision that everyone around the table can support.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I now realize that we are 1 minute away from 5 o'clock. So I wanted to thank our wonderful panelists. Everyone, claps in the chat, please. Thank you so much, guys, for your brilliant insights and your thoughts around decision making. I know that in the chat, the organisers dropped links to each of the different panelists here, so you can discover a little bit more about them and the work that they do. I would like to do a brief spruik and say that I'm doing a power talk at 5:40, and I know that it's really late in the day. It's 5:40 MST, 4:40 PST. It's on how storytelling and public space can bridge cultural divides. I invite you all to come, and I will hand things over to Riza.
All right, thank you, Emily, and thank you, panelists. I mean, what a great and important discussion. You guys really shared some tips that I'm gonna take away, and I loved hearing the different perspectives that each of you had. Now, I want to I know we have just a little bit of time left, so I just want to make sure that you, as the audience that joined us today, really consider what your biggest takeaway is from this session. We have some resources available in the digital workbook that you can access, and now that you've received these tools, we want you to really work to combat that decision fatigue that Emily mentioned and recognize the decision-making style of others, right? And approach your decision-making with an entirely new lens from this experience today. You know, and when it comes to decision making, I urge all of you to, instead of rigidity, try flexibility. Instead of overwhelm, try openness. And instead of clutter in your brain browser, try a clear outlook on your North Star goal. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. And we hope to see you at the happy hour or at Emily's session later on today. Bye.